In a small Michigan garage in 1970, a vision was born, a compact sedan that would challenge the giants of the auto industry. With its quirky design and innovative spirit, this car was the underdog. Fasten your seatbelts as we dive into the remarkable story of the AMC Hornet and other forgotten gems of the 70s. 1970 AMC Hornet. American Motors, the smallest of what used to be known as the Big Four, produced some of the most memorable cars of the 1970s. While many may recognize the Pacer, Gremlin, Javelin, and perhaps even the Matador, the Hornet often gets overlooked. This funky-looking sedan was ahead of its time, entering the market just as Americans began to realize that big cars were no longer the trend. What set the Hornet apart from its less impressive competitors was its knack for reinvention. The AMC Hornet would later be reimagined as the 1978 Concorde, and it even borrowed parts from four-wheel drive Jeep models to become the AMC Eagle, 25 years ahead of its time as a precursor to the modern crossover SUV. 1970 Ford Maverick. It's a mystery why the Maverick hasn't received more love over the past 4 decades. This humble sedan was the 1970s equivalent of a Nissan Sentra, a simple, affordable option. Yet with its groovy styling, everything deserved a fastback in the 70s, even a budget car. The Maverick was a reliable performer, but somehow it has faded into obscurity in the car community. 1972 Ford Torino. The Torino and its slightly upscale sibling, the Gran Torino, served as Ford's intermediates, valiantly battling GM's handsome midsiders. These cars fulfilled various roles, from the sporty muscular vehicle seen in the TV show Starsky and Hutch to a wood-paneled family wagon and a sensible sedan. As its Italian name suggested, the Torino combined stylish 1960s curves with the robust presence typical of 1970s cars. Produced from 1972 to 1977, the Torino was ultimately replaced by the LTD2 with its more pretentious aspirations. While muscle car versions of the Torino have garnered some collector interest, the car remains largely forgotten in the context of 1970s American automotive culture. 1971 Volkswagen 411 and 412. Riding high on the success of the Beetle, Bus, and Fastback, Volkswagen attempted to bring a luxury car to the US market with the 411 and 412. However, VW's idea of luxury was a far cry from what Americans expected. Although the blunt-nosed 411 featured the modern McPherson strut front suspension from the Super Beetle, its attempts at luxury, like metallic paint and wall-to-wall carpeting, were insufficient to compete with Cadillac. While Volkswagen did recognize the American preference for automatic transmissions, coupling it with an 80-horsepower engine meant the 411 couldn't deliver the performance Americans craved from a luxury vehicle. By 1974, VW had discontinued the Type 4, and its next luxury attempt, the Phaeton, fared no better 30 years later. 1973 Pontiac Astra. Everyone remembers the disaster that was the Chevrolet Vega, but few recall GM's initial attempt at badge engineering with the Pontiac Astra. While Chevy was dealing with the Vega's myriad issues, Pontiac was forced to release its own version, which was ultimately overshadowed by the Vega's struggles. Although GM rectified many of the Vega's problems by 1973, the Astra was still too expensive and too similar to be a success, leading to its failure in the market. 1973 Oldsmobile Omega. Badge engineering products initially met with a degree of acceptance because they were often satisfactory. The Omega, Oldsmobile's version of the Chevrolet Nova, was a solid and reliable vehicle that managed to distinguish itself from its Chevy counterpart. Buick also produced a similar model, the often overlooked Apollo, during the 1970s. However, the dark side of badge engineering would soon emerge when the Omega transitioned to the ill-fated front-wheel drive X-body platform. 1975 Ford Granada. Fashion in the 1970s was often conservative, and the Ford Granada reflected this aesthetic. Ford advertised the Granada in comparison to the Mercedes-Benz 200, an unusual claim today. Yet it resonated with the 1970s public. Between 1975 and 1980, Ford sold nearly 1.8 million Granadas, not counting the similar Mercury Monarch, making it a popular choice despite its understated style. 1977 Datsun 200 SX. While many recall Japanese automakers dominating the American market in the 1980s, it's important to remember their missteps in the 1970s as well. The Datsun 200 SX, marketed as a sporty coupe, was arguably one of the ugliest cars of its time. While Japanese cars were generally associated with economy and, to a lesser extent, sports models, the 200 SX failed to deliver on both fronts. It was sluggish and cumbersome, and although it touted superior fuel economy, it quickly earned a reputation for rusting away. Eventually, the 200 SX was forgotten, but it did inspire Datsun to launch a new version in 1980 that would become an overlooked classic. 1975 Mercury Bobcat. Badge engineering was still in its infancy in 1975 when Ford introduced the Mercury Bobcat, essentially a revamped Pinto. Although Ford stylists attempted to differentiate the Bobcat with a formal grille and modified front end, the back end left much to be desired. To distinguish the Bobcat from the Pinto, Ford rearranged the Pinto's taillights, placing them in an awkward configuration that likely fooled no one. From 1975 to 1980, Ford sold 1.3 million Pintos, while Mercury struggled to move just 225,000 Bobcats. 1978 Buick Century and Oldsmobile Cutless. America's fascination with European design intensified in the late 1970s. Consequently, when GM downsized its intermediate models for 1978, it decided that these cars needed a Euro-style hatchback profile. The result was the 2- and 4-door Arabia body style applied to the Buick Century and Oldsmobile Cutless. Unlike Chevy and Pontiac, which retained traditional notchback sedans, Buick and Oldsmobile's foray into hatchbacks was met with backlash, as evidenced by the dismal sales figures. Between 1978 and 1979, Buick sold fewer than 48,000 Century fastbacks. 1978 Ford Fairmont. The Fairmont, Ford's replacement for the Granada, represented a new wave of simplicity, stripped of all formal adornments. It was a no-frills sedan that was functional and honest, a refreshing change from the oversized vehicles that dominated Ford's lineup in the 1970s. The 2-door version, known as the Fairmont Futura, had a cool, quirky appeal. Although the Fairmont has largely been forgotten, it laid the foundation for the Fox platform, which would go on to support the Mustang for the next quarter century. 1978 Dodge Magnum. This Dodge Magnum was Chrysler's attempt at a modern personal luxury car, aiming to rival the sharply styled Ford Thunderbird of the late 1970s. Its standout feature was the clear headlight covers that flipped down when activated. Ironically, the Magnum was built on an aging midsize platform, first developed in the early 1960s, and was one of the last Chrysler passenger cars to offer a big block engine, the 400 cubic inch V8. However, during a time of economic uncertainty and rising fuel prices, consumer interest in a hefty 2-ton coupe was minimal. As a result, the Magnum sold poorly, as did its 1980s successor, the Dodge Mirada.